In the winter of 1789, deep in the duchy of Württemberg, the ancient pines of the Schwarzwald stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow and secrets older than any village tale. The wind that moved through them carried whispers. Some said of lost travelers, others of darker things that hunted beneath the moon. At the edge of this vast, brooding wilderness lay the small hamlet of Schattenwald, a cluster of timber houses huddled around a rushing stream where Heinrich Müller's mill wheel turned day and night, grinding grain into the coarse flour that kept body and soul together. Heinrich was a man worn thin by time and trouble. Once strong as the oaks he felled in his youth, he now moved with the careful gait of someone carrying invisible burdens. 3 poor harvests had emptied his stores, debts gnawed at him like rats in the granary, and the tax collector's shadow fell across his door more often than sunlight. Yet Heinrich possessed one light that still burned bright in his life: his daughter, Elise. Elise was 20 years old, and beauty like hers was both gift and danger in a place like Schattenwald. Her hair fell in thick, dark waves that caught whatever faint light pierced the mill's windows. Her skin was pale from long hours indoors, and her eyes held the shifting gray of storm clouds gathering over the forest. Watchful, intelligent, impossible to lie to. She worked beside her father from dawn until dusk, her hands strong and capable, her movements quiet and precise. The village women said she had inherited her mother's grace, though no one spoke Clara's name lightly anymore. Clara had died in childbirth when Elise was 7, taking an unborn son with her, and Heinrich had never truly smiled the same way again. These days, Elise felt her father's gaze upon her more heavily than the millstones themselves. She knew what it meant. An unmarried daughter past 20 drew whispers of misfortune, and a miller drowning in debt needed more than flour to survive. He needed alliances, security, a future. When the stranger rode into Schattenwald on a bitter October afternoon, trailing frost from his cloak, Elise felt the air change like the moment before a storm breaks. He gave his name as Konrad von Adler, a merchant from Stuttgart with interests in timber, furs, and trade along the Rhine. His horse was a magnificent black stallion, its breath steaming in the cold, and Konrad himself was everything the village men were not. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in fine wool and leather that spoke of wealth earned rather than inherited. His dark hair was tied neatly back, his beard trimmed with care, and his smile, when he chose to use it, was warm enough to melt the suspicion from most faces. He took rooms at the inn, bought rounds of ale with silver that gleamed, and told stories of distant cities and profitable ventures that made the farmers lean forward in their seats. Within days, he was a familiar sight at the mill. He brought small gifts at first, a length of ribbon the color of autumn leaves, a jar of honey from French hives, a delicate silver comb that caught the firelight like water. Heinrich blossomed under this attention like parched earth after rain. A good man, he told Elise one evening as they sat by their meager fire. Prosperous, connected. He could lift us from this struggling. Elise stirred the thin barley soup, saying nothing. From the first moment Conrad's eyes had found hers across the village square, she had felt something cold coil in her stomach. His gaze was appreciative, yes, but it was also measuring, taking inventory of her features as one might assess a horse at market. When he kissed her hand in greeting, his lips lingered a fraction too long, and his thumb pressed against her pulse point as if checking its strength. He has asked permission to court you properly, Heinrich continued, unable to contain his excitement. I have given it, gladly. The betrothal was announced at the harvest festival, beneath paper lanterns strung between the ancient oaks. Konrad presented Elise with a ring, heavy gold set with a single blood-red garnet that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. The villagers raised their mugs in toast, cheering the match that would save the mill and bring prosperity to Schattenwald. Elise smiled as expected, but the ring felt cold and heavy on her finger, and when she turned the garnet toward the moon that night, her reflection within it appeared fractured and trapped. Through the darkening autumn, Conrad's visits grew more frequent. The gifts became richer: Brussels lace, a cloak lined with silver fox, books bound in soft leather that smelled of distant libraries and ink. Yet, he revealed little of himself. Questions about his family were met with charming deflections, inquiries about his home answered with promises of future revelations. "My house lies deep in the forest," he told her once, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. "A private place, comfortable and well-appointed. You shall see it when the time is right, my bride." Elise's unease deepened like frost spreading across glass. She began to notice details that unsettled her. How birds fell silent when Conrad passed beneath their branches. How his fine clothes never bore the mud or tears one would expect from regular travel through the forest roads. How the servants who sometimes accompanied him were rough, scarred men who spoke little and watched everything with flat, predatory eyes. At night, her sleep was troubled by dreams of being watched from the darkness beyond her window, of strong hands reaching from shadows. One evening in late November, as the first true snow began to fall, Conrad arrived unannounced. The mill was quiet. Heinrich had gone to deliver flour to a neighboring village and would not return until morning. Conrad found Elise alone, sweeping the grinding floor in the dying light. He watched her work for a long moment before speaking. "You will visit my home this Sunday," he said. His voice was pleasant, but the words carried the weight of command. "I have invited guests to meet my future bride. I will mark the path with ashes so you cannot miss it." Elise's broom stilled. "My lord, there is much work here. The grain, your father has already agreed." Conrad stepped closer, his smile never wavering, though something shifted in his eyes, something cold and unyielding. It would be discourteous to refuse such a simple request. That night, sleep evaded her entirely. The wind through the pines sounded like distant crying, and she rose before dawn to fill her pockets with dried peas and lentils from the granary. Small, hard seeds that might sprout and mark a trail if wind or animals scattered Conrad's ashes. She told herself it was foolish fancy, but her hands were steady as she worked. Sunday came wrapped in iron-gray clouds, the air thick with the promise of heavy snow. Heinrich kissed her forehead as she prepared to leave, his eyes shining with pride and perhaps a touch of guilt he could not quite hide. "Be brave, my girl. This is the beginning of everything good for us." The path began innocently enough, a track used by charcoal burners and hunters that wound gently into the forest. Conrad's ashes lay pale and unmistakable against the dark earth, leading deeper than Elise had ever ventured alone. The trees grew closer together here, their branches interlocking overhead until only thin, watery light filtered through. Sound changed, her footsteps became muffled, bird calls ceased entirely. Hours passed, her legs ached, cold seeped through her wool stockings, but the ashes continued onward, pulling her inexorably into the heart of the Schwarzwald, where no village sounds could reach. She scattered her peas and lentils carefully, watching them vanish into leaf litter and snow. Time lost meaning. The weak sun began its early descent when the path suddenly opened into a clearing. There stood the house. It was larger than any in Schattenwald, built of dark timber and gray stone with steep gables and narrow windows like suspicious eyes watching her approach. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, yet no welcoming light showed within. Ivy and creepers choked the walls as if trying to pull the building back into the earth. The surrounding clearing bore no gardens, no livestock pens, only bare, trampled earth and deepening shadows. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, waiting. Elise paused at the tree line, her breath coming in white clouds that hung briefly before dissolving. From within the house came a voice, thin and reedy but perfectly clear. Turn back, young maiden dear. 'Tis a murderer's house you enter here." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She whirled, searching for the speaker, and saw a small cage hanging beside the door. Within perched a gray bird, feathers dull and unkempt, one bright eye fixed upon her. It repeated the warning exactly, its voice carrying an urgency that raised the hairs on Elise's neck. For one breathless moment she considered flight, turning and running until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, until she burst from the forest into familiar fields. But something stronger than fear held her. The need to know, to see with her own eyes what fate awaited her in this marriage her father had arranged. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped across the threshold. The house breathed cold around her. Dust lay thick on rich furniture that belonged in a noble's manor, not hidden in these woods. The air carried faint scents. Old blood, tallow smoke, something metallic that made her stomach turn. Elise moved through the rooms like a ghost, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. Tapestries covered the walls, depicting hunting scenes where the prey's eyes seemed to follow her passage. No servants appeared, no sounds of preparation for the promised feast. In the vast kitchen she found evidence of recent use, pots scrubbed meticulously clean, knives sharpened to wicked edges, a haunch of meat hanging from the rafters that she could not identify by its shape. A narrow wooden stair descended into darkness. Drawn by instinct stronger than reason, Elise lit a candle from the dying hearth and went down. The cellar was warmer, lit by a banked fire beneath an enormous iron kettle that bubbled gently. An old woman sat hunched on a stool, stirring the contents with a long paddle. Her face was a wilderness of deep wrinkles, her hair sparse and white beneath a ragged kerchief, her hands trembling with age or fear. The crone looked up as Elise's shadow fell across her, and milky eyes widened in recognition and pity. "Mercy preserve us," she whispered, voice cracking like dry leaves. "Another one, and so young, so fair." Elise found her voice. "Who are you? Where is everyone? My betrothed said there would be guests." The old woman, Greta she would later learn, set down her paddle with shaking hands. Her gaze darted toward the stairs as if expecting interruption at any moment. "Gone hunting," she said grimly. "They always go hunting before company comes. I am their servant, child. Have been these 20 years since they took me. And you?" Her eyes filled with tears. "You are the bride he's been boasting of." Elise felt ice form in her veins. "Then where are the preparations? The other servants?" Greta laughed, a bitter broken sound. "There are no other servants. No guests coming for polite supper. This is no merchant's fine house, girl. 'Tis a den of murderers, of cannibals. Your fine bridegroom is their captain, a devil in velvet. They bring women here, pretty ones snatched from roads or lured like you." She gestured toward the bubbling kettle with a trembling hand. "When they've had their sport, they make stew." The words struck Elise like physical blows. Her knees weakened, but she forced herself to stand straight. "I must leave. Now, before they return." "Too late for that," Greta said, though her eyes held a flicker of desperate hope. "They'll be back soon, drunk with the hunt. But perhaps together we can survive this night. Hide yourself, child, behind that great barrel in the corner. Be still as the dead. When they've drunk deep and fallen to sleep, maybe God will grant us a chance to escape. I've waited so long for such an opportunity." From above came the distant sound of horses, many horses, approaching through the snow. Men's voices carried on the wind, rough laughter that made Elise's blood run cold. She pressed herself into the shadows behind the massive barrel, heart pounding so loudly she feared it would betray her. The robbers were coming home, and somewhere in that approaching thunder of hooves she knew rode the man who had promised to be her husband. If this tale has stirred something in your heart, the chill of the forest, the weight of secrets, the quiet courage rising against darkness, then walk with me deeper into these forgotten stories. Subscribe now, like this video, and let us journey together through the shadows of old Europe. Your presence here means these ancient voices will not be lost to time, and there are so many more waiting to be revived. The hoofbeats grew louder, a rolling thunder that vibrated through the stone floor of the cellar and into Elise's bones. She pressed herself deeper into the narrow space behind the great oak barrel, the rough wood scraping her cheek, the smell of old wine and damp earth thick in her nostrils. Her breath came shallow and rapid. She forced it slower, terrified that even the smallest sound would betray her. Greta shuffled back to her stool, resuming her stirring with deliberate calm, though Elise could see the old woman's hands trembling on the paddle. The front door above slammed open with a crash that echoed through the empty house. Boots thudded across the floorboards, many boots, heavy and purposeful. Men's voices filled the space, coarse laughter laced with something darker, something hungry. Elise's heart hammered so fiercely she feared they might hear it through the walls. "Greta!" a voice bellowed, Conrad's voice, stripped of every trace of the polished charm he wore in the village. Here it was, deeper, rougher, commanding in a way that made Elise's skin crawl. "Is the pot ready? We've brought fresh meat for your famous stew." Laughter erupted again, wild and unrestrained. Elise heard the scrape of furniture being dragged, the clatter of tankards, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dropped onto a table. Then footsteps on the cellar stairs, several sets descending with the confidence of men who owned every shadow in this house. The first to appear was Conrad, and the sight of him stole what little breath Elise had left. Gone was the elegant merchant in fine wool and polished boots. He wore rough leather now, stained dark with travel and worse things, a heavy axe slung casually at his belt. His hair hung loose and wild, his face flushed with cold and excitement, eyes gleaming with a predatory light she had never seen in the village. Behind him came 5 others, hard men with scarred faces, matted beards, and weapons that gleamed wickedly in the firelight. They dragged something between them, a bound figure, struggling weakly. A woman, young, perhaps Elise's own age, with golden hair now tangled and muddied, her fine traveling dress torn at the sleeves. Her mouth was gagged with a strip of cloth, but her eyes, wide, terrified, pleading, met Greta's for a desperate moment before the robbers shoved her to the floor. "Look what we found on the Stuttgart road," one of the men crowed, a hulking brute with a missing ear. "Pretty little merchant's daughter traveling with her nurse. The nurse ran, didn't get far." He laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "This one's quality meat, Captain." Conrad crouched beside the captive, tilting her chin up with rough fingers. Elise watched from her hiding place as her betrothed examined the girl like livestock, turning her face this way and that. "Very pretty," he murmured almost tenderly. "She'll do nicely for tonight's entertainment." The girl made a muffled sound of terror, trying to pull away, but Conrad's grip tightened until she stilled. He stood, wiping his hands on his leather jerkin. "Greta, wine. The good stuff. 3 glasses for our guest." Greta moved with painful slowness, fetching a dusty bottle from a high shelf and 3 pewter cups. Elise watched in frozen horror as the old woman poured. First white wine, pale as moonlight, then red, dark as fresh blood, finally a yellowish liquid that smelled sharp and medicinal even from her hiding place. The robbers forced the gag from the girl's mouth and made her drink, holding her nose when she resisted until she choked down every drop. "White for innocence," Conrad said conversationally, as though discussing the weather. Red for passion, yellow for the end. The girl's struggles grew weaker almost immediately. Her eyes glazed, her body sagged between her captors. Within minutes, her breathing stopped altogether, her chest stilling with terrible finality. Elise bit down on her own fist to keep from crying out. Tears streamed silently down her face as the robbers stripped the dead girl with practiced efficiency, laying her naked body across the scarred wooden table that dominated one side of the cellar. Knives flashed. The sounds that followed, wet chopping, the scrape of blade on bone, the casual conversation of men about their work, would haunt Elise's dreams for the rest of her life. They worked quickly, portioning flesh with the skill of experienced butchers. Some pieces went into the great kettle where Greta stirred with mechanical obedience. Others were salted and hung from hooks in the ceiling beside older, darker cuts. Blood pooled on the table and dripped to the floor, the smell thick and coppery. One of the robbers, a thin man with a hooked nose, noticed something glinting on the dead girl's hand. Ring, he grunted, trying to pull it free. It stuck fast on the swollen finger. With an impatient curse, he seized the axe from Conrad's belt and brought it down in a swift, practiced motion. The severed finger arced through the air, spinning, trailing droplets of blood like dark rain. It sailed over the barrel and landed with a soft thud directly in Elise's lap. She nearly screamed. Only the terror of discovery kept the sound locked in her throat. The warm, sticky digit lay against her skirt, the gold ring with its small sapphire catching the firelight. She stared at it in paralyzed horror, unable to move, unable to think. "Where'd it go?" the hook-nosed man snarled, holding up his candle and peering into the shadows. His gaze swept dangerously close to her hiding place. "Behind the barrel?" another suggested, starting forward. Greta's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Fools! You've meat enough for a week and wine to finish. Sit and eat before it cools. The finger will keep till morning. It won't sprout legs and run off." The men laughed at this, the tension breaking. Conrad clapped the hook-nosed man on the shoulder. "The old hag speaks wisdom. Let it lie. We've earned our rest." They settled around the table, tearing into their ghastly meal with appetite, washing it down with more wine. Greta moved among them, refilling cups with hands that no longer shook. Elise, watching through a crack between barrel staves, saw the old woman add something to each fresh pouring, a fine white powder from a small pouch at her belt. One by one, the robbers' eyes grew heavy. Conversation slurred, heads nodded. Soon they sprawled across benches and floor, snoring in drunken stupor, weapons scattered carelessly about them. Only when the last man's snores joined the chorus did Greta approach the barrel. Her face in the firelight looked 100 years old. "Come, child," she whispered, extending a trembling hand. "Quickly now, before they stir." Elise emerged on legs that felt made of water. The severed finger still lay in her lap. With shaking hands, she slipped it into her pocket, ring and all. Evidence, her mind whispered through the haze of horror. Proof. They moved like ghosts through the sleeping wolves. Elise stepped carefully over outstretched limbs and abandoned weapons, her heart in her throat each time a sleeper shifted or muttered. Greta led the way up the stairs, through the silent house where moonlight now filtered through dusty windows, painting everything silver and cold. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in earnest, thick, silent flakes that already softened the tracks of the robbers' horses. The sprouted peas and lentils glowed faintly along their path, tiny green beacons in the white darkness. "Walk in my footsteps," Greta whispered as they plunged into the forest. "The snow will hide our trail by morning." They moved through the night, two women bound by shared terror and desperate hope. The cold bit deep, but fear kept them warm. Behind them, the house of horrors faded into the swirling snow, but Elise knew the true darkness lay not in the forest, but in the heart of the man who would call himself her husband. As dawn painted the sky with pale light and the mill's familiar outline appeared through the trees, Elise felt the weight of what she carried, the finger in her pocket, the images burned into her mind, the knowledge that changed everything. The wedding was still to come, and with it, her chance for justice. Dawn broke pale and cold over Schattenwald, the snow from the night's storm lying thick and untouched across the fields. The mill emerged from the mist like a dark silhouette, its wheels stilled by ice, smoke rising thin from the chimney. Elise and Greta stumbled into the yard just as the first light touched the rooftops, their clothes frozen stiff, faces burned by wind and grief. Heinrich flung open the door before they reached it, his nightshirt tucked hastily into breeches, eyes wild with fear that turned to bewildered relief. "Elise! God in heaven, child, where?" His words died as he took in their appearance, snow-crusted cloaks, trembling limbs, the hollow terror in his daughter's eyes. He reached for her, but she stepped past him into the warmth of the kitchen, pulling Greta with her. "Close the door," Elise said, her voice steady though it felt borrowed from someone braver. "And bar it." They sat by the hearth while the story poured out, not in screams or sobs, but in a quiet, relentless stream that was somehow worse. Elise spoke of the ashes leading into darkness, the warning bird, the empty house that smelled of old blood. She described the cellar, the robber's return, the girl dragged in like a sack of grain. Her voice never wavered, even when she told of the 3 wines, the axe, the finger that had flown into her lap. Only when she drew it from her pocket and laid it on the table, the small, pale digit with its sapphire ring, did Heinrich make a sound, a broken moan that seemed torn from his chest. Greta filled in what Elise could not bring herself to repeat in detail. Years of captivity, the steady stream of women who had come before, the way the robbers spoke openly of their trade when they believed no one who mattered was listening. "They take travelers, daughters, anyone who won't be missed quickly," the old woman said. "You're Conrad, he's clever. Plays the gentleman in villages, picks his prey careful. No one's ever connected the disappearances to him." Heinrich aged 10 years as he listened. When the tale ended, silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. At last he reached for the finger, wrapping it reverently in a clean cloth. "We go to the magistrate at first light," he said hoarsely. "This ends tomorrow." But Elise shook her head. "No, father, not yet." Both Heinrich and Greta stared at her. "They'll deny everything," she said. "Say we're mad with grief or lying for coin. Conrad is charming. He'll twist words until black seems white. We need them to condemn themselves in front of witnesses who cannot doubt." Her gray eyes, once soft with uncertainty, now held steel. "The wedding feast is in 3 days. He's invited half the village, magistrate, priest, wealthy farmers, everyone who matters." Heinrich paled. "You cannot mean—" "I do." Elise's voice was quiet but unbreakable. "I will play the dutiful bride one last time, and when they're all gathered, drinking his wine and praising his generosity, I will tell them my dream, every detail, and I will show them the finger." Greta's weathered face broke into something between fear and fierce pride. "Dangerous, child, if they suspect before you speak." "They won't," Elise said. "Conrad believes me docile. He thinks the visit pleased me. I sent word through a passing huntsman that I was delayed by snow, but looked forward to our marriage. He'll be smug, certain of his victory." The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended stillness. The village buzzed with preparations for the grand wedding feast. The miller's daughter marrying a wealthy merchant was the best news Schattenwald had seen in years. Gifts arrived, barrels of ale, wheels of cheese, bolts of cloth. Villagers stopped by with congratulations, marveling at Elise's calm beauty as she smiled and thanked them, the perfect bride. Inside, the mill became a fortress of planning. Heinrich sharpened his old hunting knife and hid it beneath his best coat. Greta brewed strengthening teas and whispered fragments of robber lore, what little she knew of their habits, their weaknesses. Elise practiced her story until the words flowed smooth as water, neither too emotional to be dismissed as hysteria, nor too cold to lack conviction. She slept little, but when she did, her dreams were no longer of pursuit. Now she dreamed of speaking, of watching Conrad's face as his mask cracked. The wedding day arrived under a weak winter sun that did little to warm the air. The ceremony itself was held in the village church, a simple affair since Conrad claimed his own chapel was under repair. Elise walked the aisle on Heinrich's arm, clad in the finest gown the village seamstress could manage. White wool trimmed with lace from Conrad's own gifts. Her hair was braided with ribbons, her face pale but composed. Conrad waited at the altar in velvet and silver, handsome as a prince from old tales, smiling down at her with proprietary warmth. When the priest asked if anyone objected, silence fell thick as the forest itself. Elise felt every eye upon her, felt Conrad's hand tighten possessively around hers, as the ring, the new wedding band, slid onto her finger beside the blood-red garnet. She met his gaze and smiled, small and sweet, letting him see nothing of the storm within. The feast was held in the mill's largest barn, cleared and decorated with evergreen boughs and lanterns. Long tables groaned under roasted venison. Elise wondered with a sick lurch whose hunt had provided it. Fresh bread, spiced wine flowing freely. Conrad's servants, the same scarred men Elise recognized from the cellar, now scrubbed and dressed as respectable retainers, moved among the guests with jugs and platters. The magistrate sat at the high table beside Conrad, red-faced and jovial. The priest blessed the union again over the meal. Villagers toasted the couple's happiness until voices grew loud with drink and good cheer. As the evening deepened and bellies filled, the mood turned to storytelling, a custom at weddings, meant to entertain and bless the new couple with wisdom. One by one, guests stood to share tales, old farmers telling of hard winters survived, women relating birthing stories, young men boasting of hunts. Laughter rolled through the barn, tankards clinking. At last Conrad turned to Elise, his arm heavy around her shoulders, wine loosening his smile into something almost genuine. "Come, my dove," he said loudly, for all to hear. "You've been quiet all evening. Surely my beautiful bride has a tale to share on her wedding night." The barn hushed expectantly. Every face turned toward her, curious, affectionate, trusting. Elise rose slowly, smoothing her skirts. Her heart beat steady now, the moment she had lived for these 3 sleepless nights finally here. "I will tell you all a dream I had," she began, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden quiet. "A most vivid dream just days ago." She began with the path marked in ashes leading into the deep forest. She described arriving at a grand but lonely house, the caged bird's warning, repeating its exact words until murmurs rippled through the crowd. Conrad's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered, chuckling indulgently as if at feminine fancy. Elise continued, painting the empty rooms, the descent to the cellar, the ancient woman stirring her pot. She spoke of hiding behind the barrel, hearing the robbers return with their captive. Her voice grew quieter, forcing listeners to lean in as she described the 3 wines, white, red, yellow, and what followed. Gasps escaped here and there. Some laughed nervously, thinking it a grisly jest. When she reached the chopping, the salting, the finger severed and flying through the air, Conrad's face had gone gray beneath his beard. He shifted as if to interrupt, but the magistrate, fascinated despite himself, raised a hand for silence. "And in my dream," Elise said, turning to meet her new husband's eyes directly, "that finger landed in my lap, just as this one did." She drew the cloth-wrapped object from her pocket and unwrapped it on the table before her. The severed finger lay pale in the lantern light, the sapphire ring glinting like an accusation. For a heartbeat, the barn was utterly still. Then chaos exploded. Conrad surged to his feet, face twisted in animal fury. Lies! Witches' lies! He lunged for her, hand reaching for the dagger at his belt, but Heinrich was faster, his own blade flashing as he intercepted. The servants leaped up, weapons appearing as if by magic, but the villagers, sober enough to understand what they'd heard, drunk enough to lose caution, rose with shouts of outrage. Pitchforks and hunting knives appeared, tables overturned, women screamed. In the melee, Greta's voice rose clear. "There's more proof in the forest house, graves, dozens." Conrad fought like a cornered beast, felling 2 men before Heinrich's knife found his shoulder. The magistrate, bellowing for order, seized a lantern and held it high, illuminating the horror on every face turned toward the bride, who was no longer smiling. Elise stood amid the uproar, the finger still on the table before her, feeling strangely calm. The truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft, silent, covering the world in white. But inside the barn, the reckoning had only just begun. The barn erupted into a storm of violence and revelation. Tables crashed over as men surged to their feet, tankards spilling ale across the rush-strewn floor. Women screamed, some clutching children, others grabbing whatever could serve as weapons, pokers from the fire, heavy breadboards, even the long carving knives from the feast. Conrad's men, those scarred wolves in servants' clothing, drew hidden blades with practiced speed, forming a protective ring around their captain. But they were outnumbered, and the villagers' rage was a living thing, fed by years of unspoken fears. Missing daughters, vanished travelers, livestock found butchered in ways no natural predator would. Conrad, blood streaming from the gash Heinrich's knife had opened in his shoulder, roared like a wounded bear. "Seize the lying bitch! She's mad, jealous of my wealth!" His voice still carried that commanding charm, but now it cracked with desperation. He lunged toward Elise again, murder in his eyes, but the magistrate, portly Herr Baumgartner, who had dined at Conrad's expense all evening, stepped between them, face purple with shock and fury. "Enough!" the magistrate bellowed, his authority cutting through the chaos like an axe through wood. "Bind them, all of them!" The tide turned in heartbeats. Farmers who had hunted boar in these woods knew how to corner prey. Pitchforks leveled, hunting knives flashed. Conrad's men fought viciously. One villager went down with a dagger in his thigh, another took a brutal slash across the cheek. But the robbers were drunk, surprised, and suddenly aware they were in a nest of witnesses who now knew exactly what they were. Conrad himself was brought down by 3 men at once. The blacksmith with arms like tree trunks, Heinrich with righteous vengeance, and young Lucas the cooper who had once courted Elise and never quite forgiven her betrothal. They wrestled him to the ground amid spilled wine and shattered crockery, binding his wrists with the very ribbons that had decorated the tables. His fine velvet was torn and bloodied. The handsome face that had charmed an entire village was contorted with animal hatred as he spat curses at Elise. "You'll join them in the pot yet, whore," he snarled, but his voice cracked when Heinrich's boot pressed against his throat. Elise stood untouched amid the tumult, the severed finger still on the table like silent testimony. Her gray eyes, dry now of tears, swept the barn, taking in the wounded, the terrified, the righteous anger burning in faces she had known all her life. Greta stood beside her, the old woman's frail hand clutching Elise's sleeve as if afraid she might vanish. When the robbers were bound and disarmed, 6 in total, including Conrad, the magistrate called for order. Lanterns were held high. The finger was examined, passed carefully from hand to hand, the sapphire ring recognized by a merchant who had sold its twin only months before to a traveling family from Stuttgart. Whispers became murmurs, murmurs became a roar of outrage. "Search the forest house," someone shouted. The old woman spoke of graves. A party was organized at once, 20 men with torches, axes, and guns, led by the magistrate himself. Heinrich insisted on going, though Elise begged him to stay with her. "This ends tonight," he said grimly, kissing her forehead. "Your courage deserves nothing less." They rode out into the snow, following the faint trail of peas and lentils that still showed in places the wind had not covered. Elise watched from the mill door until their torches disappeared into the trees, Greta's arm around her waist for support. The night stretched endless. Elise tended the wounded with Greta, binding cuts, brewing willow bark tea for pain, speaking calm words to frightened children. But her mind was in the forest, reliving every moment in that cellar, wondering what horrors the searchers would uncover. They returned near dawn, grim and silent. The house stood as Elise remembered it, dark, waiting. Inside they found the cellar exactly as described, the great kettle still warm, hooks bearing salted meat that no one needed to examine closely to know its origin. In the yard behind the house, beneath a thin layer of fresh snow, they located the graves, shallow pits marked only by disturbed earth. 12 bodies in various states of decay, some mere bones, others horrifyingly recent. One was identified by a locket as the missing peddler's daughter from 3 villages over. Another wore the remnants of the golden-haired girl's traveling dress. Conrad and his men were held in the village stronghouse under heavy guard. Trials followed swiftly. There was no need for lengthy proceedings when evidence lay in open graves, and the finger with its ring sat preserved in salt on the magistrate's table. Greta testified with quiet dignity, naming dates and victims she had been forced to help bury. Elise spoke last, her voice steady as winter ice, recounting every detail without flinching. Justice in those days was harsh and certain. On a gray morning 3 weeks later, beneath the same ancient oak where harvest festivals had been held, Conrad von Adler and 4 of his surviving band met the hangman's rope. The 5th had confessed everything in hope of mercy and was sentenced to life in the Duke's mines instead. Their bodies were left for the crows a full day as warning, then buried in unconsecrated ground beyond the forest's edge. Schattenwald healed slowly. The mill turned again, its wheels singing over the stream as spring thawed the snow. Heinrich, gray now but with new purpose, took Greta into the household permanently. She became the grandmother Elise had never known, teaching her herb lore and old songs by the fire. The village spoke Elise's name with reverence. Young women came to her for advice, and parents told their daughters her story as both warning and inspiration. Trust your instincts, speak your truth, no matter how dark the forest or charming the wolf. Elise herself changed most of all. The quiet girl who had once accepted her father's choices without protest became a woman of quiet strength. She never married. Suitors came, respectful and kind, but she felt no need for a man to complete her life. Instead, she ran the mill with steady competence, expanding it until flour from Schattenwald fed 3 surrounding villages. On quiet evenings, she walked the forest paths alone, no longer afraid of shadows, scattering seeds in spring so that green life always marked her way. Years later, travelers passing through would hear the tale, how a miller's daughter unmasked a band of cannibal robbers through courage and cunning, how she turned her wedding feast into their judgment day. Some said on certain snowy nights you could still hear the caged bird's warning carried on the wind. Turn back, young maiden dear, 'tis a murderer's house you enter here. But those who knew the full story understood the deeper truth Elise had learned and lived, that monsters often wear the faces of those who promise safety, and that the greatest power lies not in silence, but in refusing to accept the darkness as inevitable. In the end, the forest kept its teeth, but it also kept its secrets less well. Light had been let in, and some shadows never returned.